The day of the evaluation arrived with little fanfare at Luna Base, but Jake could feel the tension throughout the facility. The entire team had been working for months to prepare for this moment, and now everything depended on the next few hours. The main conference room had been transformed into a communication center that could connect with the collective assembly anywhere in the galaxy. Jake stood in the center of the room, wearing a simple blue suit that Commander Park had said would appear non-threatening to the various alien species. Around him, holographic projectors created a three-dimensional space that would make him appear to be standing in the middle of the collective's grand assembly hall, even though he was actually on the moon. As the connection activated, Jake found himself surrounded by the most incredible sight he had ever experienced. Hundreds of alien beings appeared around him in holographic form, representing species from across the galaxy. Some looked vaguely humanoid, while others were so different that Jake had trouble understanding what he was seeing. There were beings made of crystalline structures, creatures that seemed to be composed of pure energy, and life forms that existed as collective consciousness rather than individual bodies. The session was presided over by a being that the files had identified as High Coordinator Zethka, a member of one of the oldest species in the collective. Zethka appeared as a tall, graceful figure with silvery skin and large, intelligent eyes. When it spoke, its words were automatically translated into English by the communication system. Zethka explained the evaluation process to Jake and the assembled delegates. Humanity's case would be presented in 3 parts, covering technological achievement, social development, and species potential. After each presentation, there would be a period for questions and challenges from collective members. Finally, there would be a formal debate followed by a vote on whether to accept humanity as a provisional member. Jake began with the technological presentation that his father's team had spent decades preparing. He demonstrated the fusion reactors that could provide clean energy for centuries, the medical nanobots that could eliminate most diseases, and the communication systems that could connect civilizations across vast distances. The technology was impressive, and Jake could see that many of the alien delegates were genuinely interested in what humanity had accomplished. But the questions that followed were challenging. Several species pointed out that the technology was based on principles that the aliens had provided, not discoveries that humans had made independently. Others questioned whether humans could be trusted to use such powerful technology responsibly, given their history of using scientific advances to create weapons. Jake had prepared for these objections and responded by showing how humans had improved on the alien designs in unexpected ways. The fusion reactors were more efficient than the original alien versions, and the medical nanobots had capabilities that even the aliens had not thought possible. He argued that humanity's greatest strength was its ability to take existing knowledge and find new applications for it. The social development presentation was more difficult because it required Jake to address thousands of years of human conflict and violence. He showed statistics about declining war casualties, increased international cooperation, and growing environmental awareness. He presented evidence that humans were becoming more peaceful and cooperative as their technology advanced and their basic needs were met, but the opposition was fierce. Several alien species had been monitoring Earth for centuries and had documented every war, genocide, and environmental disaster in human history. They argued that recent improvements were temporary and superficial, and that humans would return to their violent ways as soon as they faced new challenges or gained access to more powerful technology. One particularly vocal opponent was a representative of a species called the Eternal Watchers, who had been observing Earth longer than any other collective member. The Watcher presented a detailed analysis of human behavior that painted a disturbing picture of a species driven by greed, fear, and tribal hatred. It argued that humans were fundamentally incapable of the kind of wisdom and restraint required for membership in an advanced galactic civilization. Jake found himself defending not just humanity's recent progress, but the entire concept of human nature. He acknowledged the dark chapters in human history but argued that they represented growing pains rather than permanent characteristics. He pointed to examples of human courage, compassion, and sacrifice that showed the species' potential for moral growth. The debate continued for hours, with supporters and opponents of human membership making increasingly passionate arguments. Jake was surprised to discover that humanity actually had several strong advocates among the alien species. Some had been impressed by human creativity and adaptability, while others admired the species' determination to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. But it was the final presentation on species potential that would determine humanity's fate. This was where Jake presented his advocacy statement, making the case for why humans deserved a chance to prove themselves as members of the galactic community. Jake spoke from the heart about humanity's greatest strength, which was also its greatest weakness. Humans were chaotic and unpredictable, often violent and destructive, but they were also capable of incredible growth and change. Unlike many species that had evolved in stable environments, humans had developed in a world of constant challenge and conflict, which had made them extraordinarily adaptable. He argued that this adaptability was exactly what the collective needed, as it faced new challenges in an ever-changing galaxy. While other species might struggle to adjust to unexpected threats or opportunities, humans had proven repeatedly that they could reinvent themselves when circumstances required it. Jake also addressed the concept of universal responsibility by showing how human thinking had already begun to expand beyond tribal and national boundaries. The same species that had once fought endless wars over territory and resources was now working together on global challenges like climate change and disease. Given access to technology that could eliminate scarcity and competition, humans would have no reason to maintain their destructive behaviors. The most powerful part of Jake's presentation was his vision of what humanity could contribute to the collective. He argued that human creativity and problem-solving ability could help other species overcome challenges they had never considered. Human art, music, and literature could enrich the cultural life of the entire galaxy. Most importantly, human experience with conflict and reconciliation could help the collective deal with future crises that might threaten galactic peace. When Jake finished his presentation, the assembly hall fell silent for several long moments. Then High Coordinator Zethka called for the formal debate phase, during which supporters and opponents of human membership would make their final arguments. The debate was intense and emotional, with some species arguing passionately for giving humanity a chance while others insisted that humans were too dangerous to trust. The Eternal Watchers presented a detailed case for immediate quarantine, arguing that every day of delay increased the risk that humans would develop space travel and begin threatening other worlds. But humanity's supporters were equally passionate. A species called the Star Weavers argued that the collective had a moral obligation to help young species evolve, rather than simply punishing them for their immaturity. Another group, the Harmony Builders, pointed out that every current collective member had gone through a period of violence and conflict before achieving wisdom, and that humans deserved the same opportunity for growth. The debate continued for what felt like hours before High Coordinator Zethka finally called for the vote. The process was conducted in complete silence, with each species privately transmitting their decision to the Central Assembly computer. Jake stood in the center of the holographic chamber, watching the faces of beings from across the galaxy as they decided the fate of his entire species. When the voting was complete, Zethka announced the results with formal ceremony. The vote had been close, much closer than Jake had dared to hope. By a margin of just 37 votes out of more than 800, the collective had decided to grant humanity provisional membership. The provisional status meant that Earth would be integrated into the galactic community gradually over a period of 50 years. Human representatives would be allowed to participate in collective activities and receive access to advanced technologies, but they would be closely monitored to ensure they use these gifts responsibly. If humanity proved itself during this probationary period, they would be granted full membership with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. As the assembly dissolved and the holographic images began to fade, Jake felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. Humanity had been given a chance to join the stars, to become part of something larger and more wonderful than anyone on Earth had ever imagined. Commander Park and the rest of the Luna Base team surrounded Jake with congratulations and celebration, but he found himself thinking about his father. The journey to Luna Base was unlike anything Jake could have imagined. A sleek spacecraft that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie landed silently in the field behind his father's farmhouse at exactly midnight. The pilot was Dr. Chenwei, who explained that the ship used alien propulsion technology that could reach the moon in less than 2 hours. As Earth fell away beneath them, Jake watched his home planet shrink to a blue marble against the darkness of space. Dr. Chen told him that this might be the last time he would see Earth for a very long time, possibly forever. If humanity failed the evaluation, the team members at Luna Base would not be allowed to return to their home world. Luna Base was hidden in a crater on the dark side of the moon, invisible from Earth and protected by alien technology that made it undetectable to human satellites. As their spacecraft approached, Jake could see the base emerging from what had looked like empty rock. Buildings and structures appeared as if materializing from nothing, revealing a complex that was larger than most cities on Earth. Commander Park met them at the landing area and immediately took Jake on a tour of the facility. The base was home to nearly 200 people from dozens of countries, all working together on different aspects of humanity's case for membership in the collective. There were scientists, engineers, diplomats, artists, philosophers, and even poets, all contributing their expertise to the most important project in human history. The main control center was breathtaking, with holographic displays showing star maps, alien communications, and real-time data about the evaluation process. Jake could see messages coming in from collective worlds throughout the galaxy, some offering encouragement for humanity's efforts and others expressing skepticism about whether humans could ever be trusted with advanced technology. Dr. Hayes was already at Luna Base and had been working around the clock to complete the technical portions of Carl's presentation. She showed Jake the latest version of the fusion reactor designs and explained how they had been improved even further since his father's death. The new reactors were not only more efficient but also smaller and easier to build, making them practical for widespread use on Earth. Commander Turner had also decided to join the team and had arrived just days before Jake. He was working on the military and security aspects of the presentation, trying to address the collective's concerns about human violence. His approach was to show how the advanced technologies could actually reduce the likelihood of war by eliminating the scarcity and competition that caused most conflicts. Dr. Foster had been the last to arrive and was focusing on the biological and environmental sections of the presentation. She had brought with her data showing how the medical nanobots could not only cure diseases, but also help repair environmental damage. The same technology that could heal human bodies could also clean polluted water, restore damaged soil, and even reverse some forms of climate change. But the most challenging part of the presentation was still incomplete. Jake learned that his main responsibility would be to create what the aliens called the species advocacy statement. This was a philosophical and emotional argument for why humanity deserved to join the collective, addressing their concerns about human nature and demonstrating that the species had the potential for growth and change. Commander Park explained that this was the most important part of the entire presentation because it dealt with the fundamental question that the aliens were asking about humanity. They were not just evaluating human technology or even human behavior. They were trying to determine whether humans had the wisdom and maturity to be trusted as members of an advanced galactic civilization. The species advocacy statement had to address thousands of years of human violence, environmental destruction, and social inequality. It had to acknowledge these problems honestly while also making the case that humanity was capable of transcending them. It had to show that humans could evolve beyond their primitive instincts and embrace the higher principles that governed the collective. Jake spent his first week at Luna Base studying examples of successful advocacy statements from other species that had been accepted into the collective. Each one was unique, reflecting the particular history and culture of the species involved. But they all shared certain common elements that Jake would need to incorporate into humanity's statement. The most important element was what the aliens called authentic transformation evidence. This meant showing that the species had genuinely changed their fundamental nature, not just temporarily modified their behavior. The aliens had seen too many species that appeared peaceful during the evaluation period, but returned to violence once they gained access to advanced technology. Jake also had to address the concept of universal responsibility, which was central to collective philosophy. Member species were expected to consider the welfare of all intelligent life, not just their own people. This was particularly challenging for humans, who had a long history of tribal thinking and competition between different groups. The final element was contributive potential, which meant demonstrating what unique value humanity could bring to the collective. Each member species was expected to contribute something distinctive to the galactic community, whether it was technological innovation, artistic expression, philosophical insight, or some other form of cultural enrichment. As Jake worked on the advocacy statement, he spent time with team members from around the world who helped him understand different perspectives on human nature and potential. Dr. Chen shared insights from Chinese philosophy about harmony and balance. Dr. Johnson offered examples from British literature about the human capacity for moral growth. Colonel Rodriguez told stories from his military experience about courage and sacrifice. Dr. Patel discussed Indian concepts of consciousness and spiritual development. But Jake also had to confront the darker aspects of human history that the aliens would inevitably bring up during the evaluation. He studied files about wars, genocides, environmental destruction, and social injustice that painted a disturbing picture of human behavior. The advocacy statement would have to acknowledge these failures while somehow making the case that they represented humanity's past rather than its future. The breakthrough came when Jake realized that humanity's greatest strength might also be its greatest weakness. Humans were incredibly diverse and often conflicted, which led to competition and violence. But this same diversity also made them adaptable, creative, and capable of rapid change when faced with new challenges. Jake began to structure the advocacy statement around the idea that humanity's turbulent history was actually evidence of the species' potential for growth. Other species that had joined the collective had often been more peaceful in their development, but they had also been more static and predictable. Humans had the unique ability to reinvent themselves when circumstances required it. To support this argument, Jake gathered examples of rapid human progress in areas like science, technology, social justice, and environmental protection. He showed how humans had repeatedly overcome seemingly impossible challenges by working together and changing their fundamental assumptions about what was possible. The statement also addressed the collective's concerns about human violence by reframing it as a survival mechanism that was no longer necessary. Jake argued that human aggression had evolved in a harsh environment where resources were scarce and survival was uncertain. But as humans gained access to advanced technology that could eliminate scarcity, the evolutionary pressure for violence would disappear. Jake worked on the advocacy statement for 3 weeks, revising and refining it based on feedback from the team and guidance from the few remaining alien advisors. The final version was a passionate but carefully reasoned argument for humanity's membership in the collective, acknowledging the species' flaws while making a compelling case for its potential. But even as Jake completed the advocacy statement, he knew that the presentation alone might not be enough. The team had received intelligence that several influential collective members remained strongly opposed to human membership. These species had been watching Earth for centuries and were convinced that humans were too dangerous to be trusted with advanced technology. Commander Park told Jake that the evaluation would not just be a presentation, but also a debate, with supporters and opponents of human membership making their cases before the full collective assembly. Jake would need to be prepared not just to present humanity's achievements, but also to defend against accusations and challenges from species that had already made up their minds against Earth. The pressure was enormous, but Jake felt ready for the challenge. He had spent weeks learning about alien psychology and diplomatic protocols. He had studied the history and philosophy of the collective. Most importantly, he had developed a deep understanding of humanity's strengths and weaknesses that would allow him to make an honest but hopeful case for his species. As the evaluation date approached, Jake knew that he was as prepared as he could possibly be. Whether humanity would be accepted into the collective or exiled to a quarantine system would depend on his ability to convince advanced alien civilizations that humans deserved a chance to prove themselves among the stars. Jake was working late in his father's facility when the main communication array suddenly activated on its own. Lights began flashing across the control panels, and the large wall display showed incoming signals from somewhere in space. Jake had been studying the equipment for days but had never seen it operate at full capacity like this. A holographic image appeared in the center of the room, showing a woman in what looked like a military uniform. She appeared to be in her 40s with short dark hair and serious eyes. Behind her, Jake could see what looked like a high-tech control room with windows showing stars and the curve of a planet that looked like Earth. The woman spoke with clear authority and obvious urgency. She introduced herself as Commander Lisa Park, Carl's former colleague and the current director of what she called the Luna Base facility. She explained that she had been trying to contact Carl for several weeks, but had received no response. When the communication array finally activated, she had detected Jake's genetic signature and realized that something must have happened to his father. Jake explained about Carl's death and his own discovery of the hidden facility. Commander Park listened carefully and then told him things that made the situation even more complex than he had imagined. The Luna Base was a secret facility hidden on the dark side of the moon, built with alien technology and staffed by the surviving members of the original Project Gateway team. According to Commander Park, the project had actually been much larger than Jake had realized. While his father had been working alone in Montana for the past 10 years, there had been other team members operating from facilities around the world and even in space. The Luna Base had been established as the central coordination point for all of humanity's contact with the collective. Commander Park explained that Carl's death had created a crisis for the entire project. As the lead scientist and chief diplomat, he had been responsible for coordinating all of the research efforts and maintaining relationships with the alien advisors. Without his leadership, the other team members had been struggling to complete their work and meet the approaching deadline. But there was another problem that Jake had not known about. The aliens had not just been evaluating humanity based on technological progress and social development. They had also been conducting secret tests of individual humans to identify those who might be suitable for leadership roles in the galactic community. Carl had been one of only a handful of humans who had passed these tests and been deemed capable of representing the species. The alien evaluation process was complex and involved assessments of intelligence, emotional stability, moral judgment, and what they called species loyalty. This last quality referred to the ability to make decisions based on the good of humanity as a whole, rather than personal interests or the interests of any particular nation or group. According to the aliens, most humans failed this test because they were too focused on short-term gains or narrow tribal loyalties. Commander Park told Jake that his genetic markers indicated he might have inherited some of his father's rare qualities, but he would need to undergo testing to be sure. The aliens respected bloodline continuity and were willing to consider Jake as a potential replacement for his father, but only if he could demonstrate the same capabilities that had made Carl valuable to the project. This revelation made Jake realize that he had not fully understood what he was getting involved in. He had thought that finishing his father's presentation was just a matter of completing technical work and assembling evidence about human progress. But it was actually much more personal and much more dangerous. He would not just be presenting humanity's case to the aliens, he would be taking on the role of humanity's representative in the galactic community. Commander Park explained that if Jake agreed to continue his father's work, he would need to come to the Luna Base for training and preparation. The facility had equipment and resources that were not available on Earth, including direct communication links with several alien species and access to technologies that were still being developed. The training would be intensive and would require him to learn not just about alien technology, but also about alien psychology and diplomatic protocols. The other team members at Luna Base included some of the most brilliant scientists and engineers from around the world. Dr. Chen Wei was a Chinese physicist who had been working on advanced propulsion systems. Dr. Sarah Johnson was a British biologist who specialized in interspecies communication. Colonel Mike Rodriguez was a former Air Force pilot who had been testing alien spacecraft designs. Dr. Rajesh Patel was an Indian computer scientist who had been developing artificial intelligence systems based on alien neural networks. But Commander Park also warned Jake about the risks involved in coming to Luna Base. Once he left Earth, he would be committed to seeing the project through to completion. The aliens had made it clear that they would not allow anyone with knowledge of their technology to return to normal life if humanity failed the evaluation. Jake would either succeed in gaining membership for humanity or spend the rest of his life in exile on the moon. Jake asked about the other surviving team members on Earth and learned that they were facing similar choices. Dr. Hayes, Commander Turner, and Dr. Foster had all been invited to join the Luna Base team for the final phase of the project. Dr. Hayes had already agreed to come, but the others were still deciding whether they were willing to risk everything on one last attempt to save humanity. Commander Park also told Jake about recent developments that made the situation more urgent. The alien advisors had detected increased military activity around several of the Earth-based facilities. Some government agencies that were not part of the project had apparently learned about the alien contact and were trying to locate and seize the advanced technology. If they succeeded, it could destroy any chance of humanity being accepted into the collective. The aliens viewed the existence of competing factions within humanity as evidence that the species was not ready for advanced technology. They had specifically warned that any attempt to use their technology for military purposes or to gain advantage over other humans would result in immediate disqualification from consideration for membership. This meant that the project team was now racing against two deadlines. They had to complete their presentation to the collective before the evaluation date, but they also had to do it before Earth's governments discovered their facilities and potentially compromised the entire mission. Commander Park estimated that they had at most 8 weeks before the security situation became impossible to maintain. Jake realized that he was being asked to make one of the most important decisions in human history, and he had to make it quickly. If he agreed to join the Luna Base team, he would be committing himself to a mission that could save or doom the entire human species. If he refused, humanity would lose one of its few remaining advocates and probably face exile to the quarantine system. But Jake also understood that this was what his father had been preparing him for his entire life. Carl had chosen to live quietly in Montana not just to maintain security for the project, but also to give his son a normal childhood and education that would prepare him for this moment. Everything that had happened, from Carl's secretive work to his preserved remains that had allowed Jake to access the facility, had been leading to this choice. Commander Park gave Jake 24 hours to make his decision. During that time, he could use the communication array to speak with the other team members and learn more about what the mission would involve. But after that, the window for joining the Luna Base team would close and humanity would have to face the evaluation with whatever resources they had left. Jake spent the night walking around his father's facility, thinking about the life he would be giving up and the responsibility he would be taking on. He thought about his job in Denver, his friends, and the normal future he had planned for himself. All of that would disappear if he agreed to continue his father's work, but he also thought about what would happen to humanity if he refused. Billions of people would be exiled to a distant star system, never knowing that they had been so close to joining an advanced galactic civilization. Future generations would grow up isolated and alone, cut off from the wonders of the universe that his father had worked so hard to make accessible. By morning, Jake had made his decision. He activated the communication array and told Commander Park that he was ready to come to Luna Base and take on his father's role as humanity's advocate. Whatever the risks, he could not live with himself if he did not at least try to finish the work that Carl had started. Commander Park seemed relieved and told him that transportation would be arranged within 48 hours. Jake would have that much time to prepare himself mentally and physically for the journey to the moon and the most important mission in human history. Jake spent the next week learning to operate his father's equipment and studying the technological achievements that were supposed to save humanity. What he discovered amazed him and made him understand why the aliens might actually consider accepting humans into their community. Carl's team had accomplished things that seemed impossible by current human standards. The fusion reactors they had developed were completely clean and safe, producing enormous amounts of energy without any radioactive waste or risk of meltdown. The design was based on alien physics principles but had been improved by human engineering in ways that even impressed the alien advisors. According to the test results, a single reactor could power an entire city for decades, using nothing but hydrogen extracted from seawater. The medical nanobots were even more impressive. These microscopic machines could be injected into the bloodstream and would automatically seek out and destroy cancer cells, repair damaged organs, and eliminate most known diseases. They were programmed to work for exactly 1 year before dissolving harmlessly, which prevented them from being used as weapons or causing unexpected side effects. Jake found video recordings of test results that showed paralyzed patients walking, again within days of receiving the nanobots, cancer patients being completely cured within weeks, and elderly people regaining the health and vitality of much younger adults. The technology could essentially eliminate most of the medical problems that had plagued humanity throughout history. The communication technology was perhaps the most revolutionary of all. The quantum communication arrays could send messages instantly across any distance, even between different star systems. They worked by creating quantum-entangled particles that remained connected regardless of how far apart they were moved. When one particle was manipulated, the other would change immediately, allowing for instantaneous communication across the galaxy. Carl's team had built several of these arrays and had been using them to communicate with the alien members of the collective. Jake found transcripts of conversations that his father had held with alien scientists and diplomats, discussing everything from technical specifications to philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness and morality. But, as Jake studied the files more carefully, he discovered a serious problem. While the technologies themselves were complete and functional, the team had never been able to demonstrate them to the world. Everything had been kept secret because of security concerns and because the alien advisors had insisted that the technology could only be revealed if humanity was accepted into the collective. This created a paradox that had been frustrating Carl for years. The collective wanted to see evidence that humans could use advanced technology responsibly, but the technology could not be revealed until humans were already accepted. The team had been able to conduct small-scale tests in secret, but they had never been able to show how the technology would transform human civilization on a global scale. Jake found his father's notes about this problem and his proposed solution. Carl had argued that the test phase needed to end, and humanity needed to be given a chance to prove itself with the real technology. He had been working on a plan to reveal the existence of the alien contact and demonstrate the advanced technologies to world leaders, allowing them to make an informed decision about how to proceed. The plan was risky because it would expose the decades of secrecy and potentially cause panic or conflict, as different nations tried to claim the technology for themselves. But Carl believed it was the only way to give humanity a real chance at meeting the collective's requirements. The aliens could see how humans actually behaved when given access to transformative technology, rather than just guessing based on historical patterns. Jake also discovered that time was running out in another way. The alien advisors who had been working with Carl's team were being recalled by the collective as the deadline approached. The collective did not want their citizens involved if humanity failed the test and had to be relocated to the quarantine system. Within the next few months, Earth would be completely cut off from alien contact until the final evaluation. This meant that Jake would not be able to get help from the aliens if he decided to continue his father's work. He would have to rely entirely on the equipment and information that Carl had left behind, along with whatever assistance he could get from the surviving members of the human team. Jake used the communication array to contact the other team members, and learned that the situation was even worse than he had thought. Of the original 12-person team, only 3 others were still alive and able to work. Dr. Linda Hayes was a physicist in her 70s who had been working from a facility hidden beneath a university in California. Commander Bob Turner was a former astronaut in his 80s who operated from a base disguised as a ranch in Texas. Dr. Amy Foster was a biologist in her 60s who worked from a laboratory hidden in the mountains of Colorado. When Jake explained who he was and that he wanted to continue his father's work, the other team members were both relieved and concerned. They were grateful that someone was willing to take on the responsibility, but they worried that Jake did not have enough time to learn everything he needed to know before the deadline. Dr. Hayes explained that Carl had been the team leader and the only one who fully understood all aspects of the project. The others were experts in their own fields but did not have the broad knowledge necessary to complete the final presentation to the collective. They had been hoping that Carl would recover from his illness and finish the work, but his sudden death had left them without clear leadership. Commander Turner told Jake about the military aspects of the project that had been kept secret, even from the civilian team members. The government had been preparing for the possibility that humanity would fail the test and be forced into quarantine. There were contingency plans for resistance movements and hidden colonies that could continue human civilization even if Earth was evacuated. But Turner believed these plans were hopeless against technology that was thousands of years more advanced than anything humans possessed. Dr. Foster shared her concerns about the biological aspects of the quarantine process. According to the alien files, relocated species were sometimes modified to make them less aggressive or to help them adapt to their new environment. She worried that humans who were sent to the quarantine system might not remain fully human, but instead be changed into something more acceptable to the collective. All three of the surviving team members agreed that completing Carl's presentation was humanity's best hope for avoiding quarantine. But they also warned Jake that the task might be impossible for someone without years of training in alien technology and diplomatic protocols. The presentation had to be perfect, because there would be no second chances. Jake spent several days reviewing the incomplete presentation and trying to understand what still needed to be done. Carl had completed most of the technical sections, documenting the fusion reactors, medical nanobots, and communication arrays. He had also gathered extensive data about human social progress and evidence of increased international cooperation. But the presentation was missing several critical elements. There was no clear argument for why humanity deserved to be trusted with advanced technology, no response to the collective's concerns about human violence and environmental destruction, and no vision for how humans would contribute to the galactic community. These were the most important parts of the presentation, because they addressed the fundamental question of whether humanity had evolved enough to be worthy of membership. Jake realized that completing the presentation would require more than just technical knowledge. He would need to understand humanity well enough to make a compelling case for the species' potential. He would need to address decades of alien concerns about human behavior and convince advanced civilizations that humans could change their fundamental nature. As Jake worked on understanding the scope of the task ahead of him, he began to feel the weight of responsibility that his father had carried for so many years. The fate of every human being who had ever lived or would ever live depended on getting this right. If he failed, humanity would spend eternity isolated from the rest of the galaxy, never knowing what they might have achieved as part of the collective. But Jake also began to feel something else that surprised him. Despite the enormous pressure and the seemingly impossible odds, he was starting to feel excited about the challenge. This was the most important work that any human had ever undertaken, and he had been given the chance to help determine the future of his entire species. Whatever happened, he would not be able to live with himself if he did not at least try to finish what his father had started. Jake decided he needed to understand exactly what humanity was facing before he could make any decisions. He spent the next 2 days reading through every file in his father's facility, learning about the Harmony Collective and Earth's place in the galaxy. What he discovered was both amazing and terrifying. The Harmony Collective was much larger than Jake had initially understood. It included 847 different species spread across thousands of star systems in this part of the galaxy. Some of these species had been spacefaring for millions of years, while others had joined more recently after proving their worth. The collective operated on principles of peaceful cooperation, shared knowledge, and mutual protection against threats from outside their territory. According to the files, Earth was located in what the aliens called the Outer Rim, a region of space that was considered primitive and potentially dangerous. Most of the intelligent species in this area were either too young to be considered for membership or too violent to be trusted with advanced technology. Earth fell into both categories, which made humanity's situation particularly difficult. The collective had first become aware of Earth during the early days of human civilization, when they detected radio signals from the planet. They had been monitoring human development for over 1,000 years, watching as humans slowly developed technology and social systems. Unfortunately, most of what they had observed had not impressed them. Jake read detailed reports that alien observers had filed about human behavior over the centuries. They had documented every major war, every act of environmental destruction, every example of humans treating each other with cruelty and violence. The aliens saw humans as a species that was intelligent enough to be dangerous, but not wise enough to be trusted with power. The situation had become more urgent in the 20th century, when humans developed nuclear weapons and space travel. The collective realized that it would not be long before humans began expanding beyond Earth, potentially bringing their violent tendencies to other worlds. This led to a debate within the collective about what to do with humanity. Some alien species wanted to eliminate the human threat before it could spread. Others argued for immediate intervention to force humans to change their behavior. But the majority decided on a compromise solution that became known as the Humanity Protocol. Earth would be given a chance to prove that the species could evolve beyond its violent nature. But if they failed, all humans would be relocated to a quarantine system where they could not threaten other civilizations. The quarantine system was described in the files as a group of planets in a distant part of the galaxy, far from any major trade routes or inhabited systems. The planets were habitable but primitive, with no advanced technology or means of space travel. Humans relocated there would be able to survive and even thrive, but they would never be able to leave or make contact with other species. Jake found this idea deeply disturbing. The aliens were essentially planning to turn humanity into prisoners on a cosmic scale, exiling the entire species to a remote corner of the galaxy if they did not meet certain standards. It seemed cruel and unfair, especially since humans had never asked to be judged by alien standards in the first place. But as Jake read more about the collective's history, he began to understand their perspective. The files contained examples of other young species that had been given similar chances and had failed. Some had destroyed themselves with wars or environmental catastrophe. Others had become aggressive and expansionist, requiring military intervention from the collective to stop them from conquering their neighbors. One case study particularly caught Jake's attention. A species called the Dominators had been very similar to humans in their development. They had been intelligent, creative, and technologically advanced, but also violent and territorial. The collective had tried to guide them toward peaceful behavior, but the Dominators had used the knowledge they gained to build better weapons and conquer other worlds. The war that followed had lasted for 50 years and had resulted in the destruction of 17 inhabited planets. Billions of beings had died before the collective was finally able to defeat the Dominators and relocate the survivors to a quarantine system. The experience had made the collective much more cautious about allowing aggressive species to develop advanced technology. Jake also learned about success stories that gave him hope. Several species had started out as violent and primitive as humans but had eventually evolved to become valued members of the collective. The key was proving that they could change their fundamental nature and embrace the principles of peace and cooperation that the collective required. The requirements for membership were clearly spelled out in the files. A species had to demonstrate advanced technology that could benefit the collective, stable social systems that prevented large-scale violence, environmental stewardship that protected their home world, and a philosophy that valued cooperation over competition. They also had to show that they could work together with other species without trying to dominate or exploit them. Carl's team had been working for 40 years to help humanity meet these requirements. They had developed fusion technology that could provide clean energy for the entire planet. They had created medical nanobots that could cure cancer, heart disease, and most other illnesses that plagued humanity. They had designed communication systems that could allow instant contact across interstellar distances. But technology alone was not enough. Humanity also had to prove that it had matured as a species. This was the most difficult requirement to meet because it required changes in human behavior and society that could not be forced or faked. The aliens were looking for evidence that humans had learned to resolve conflicts peacefully, protect their environment, and work together for the common good. Jake found reports that his father's team had compiled about human progress in these areas. There had been some encouraging developments over the past few decades. The number of wars had decreased, international cooperation had increased, and environmental awareness had grown significantly. But there had also been setbacks, including continued conflicts in some parts of the world and ongoing environmental problems that threatened the planet's future. The most recent reports showed that humanity was making progress, but not fast enough to meet the collective's deadline. The aliens required clear evidence that humans had fundamentally changed their nature, not just temporary improvements that might be reversed when times became difficult. They wanted to see sustained peaceful behavior over several generations, not just a few years of relative calm. This was where Carl's presentation became critical. He had been working to compile evidence that would convince the collective that humanity had reached a turning point. The presentation would include not just technological demonstrations, but also social and cultural evidence that humans were ready to join the galactic community. Jake found draft versions of the presentation that showed how comprehensive Carl's approach had been. He had gathered statistics on declining violence rates, examples of international cooperation on global problems, documentation of environmental restoration projects, and testimonials from world leaders about humanity's commitment to peace. He had also prepared demonstrations of the advanced technologies that could benefit other collective members. But the presentation was incomplete. Carl had died before finishing the final sections that would tie everything together and make the case for humanity's membership. Without this presentation, the collective would make their decision based only on their historical observations of human behavior, which would almost certainly result in a vote for quarantine. Jake realized that the fate of the entire human species might depend on whether someone could complete his father's work. The deadline was now less than 6 months away, and there was no one else who understood the alien technology well enough to operate it properly. The other team members were too old or too sick to take on such a massive responsibility. As Jake sat in his father's facility, surrounded by technology that could transform human civilization, he began to understand the weight of the decision he was facing. If he walked away, humanity would likely be exiled to a distant star system, cut off from the rest of the galaxy forever. If he stayed and tried to complete his father's work, he would be taking on the most important task in human history, with no guarantee that he could succeed. The files made it clear that this was humanity's last chance. The collective had been patient for decades, but they would not extend the deadline again. Whatever happened in the next few months would determine whether humans would join the galactic community or spend the rest of their existence as prisoners in a cosmic quarantine. Jake spent the next several hours reading through his father's files, and each document he found made the situation more unbelievable. The room contained 40 years of detailed records about Earth's secret contact with alien civilizations. Carl Morrison had not just been involved in this contact, he had been one of the main people responsible for it. According to the files, first contact had happened in 1962, when an alien probe had crashed in the Nevada desert. The government had recovered the probe and eventually figured out how to send a response signal. Within a few years, they were in regular communication with several different alien species. By the time Carl joined the program in 1983, Earth had established formal diplomatic relations with 12 different alien worlds. The program was called Project Gateway, and its mission was to prove that humanity deserved to join what the aliens called the Harmony Collective. This was a group of advanced civilizations that worked together to maintain peace and share technology across the galaxy. Earth had been under observation by the collective for hundreds of years, but humans had always been considered too primitive and violent to be allowed to join. Carl's job had been to develop technologies that would prove humanity was ready for membership in the collective. The aliens had provided some basic information about advanced physics and engineering, but humans had to prove they could understand and improve on these concepts. If they succeeded, Earth would be invited to join the collective and receive access to incredible technologies that could solve problems like disease, hunger, and environmental destruction. Jake found his father's personal journal from 1983, when he first joined the program. Carl wrote about how excited he was to be working on the most important project in human history. He believed that contact with the aliens would transform human civilization and create a better future for everyone. He had been chosen for the program because of his engineering skills and his ability to think in new ways about problems that had never been encountered before. The journal entries from the early years showed Carl's enthusiasm and optimism about the project. He wrote about breakthrough discoveries and successful tests of new technologies. He described meetings with alien representatives who visited Earth in secret, always at night, and always in isolated locations. The aliens were friendly but careful, treating humans like children who needed to be taught slowly and safely. But as Jake read through journals from later years, he could see that Carl's optimism had gradually turned to worry and frustration. The program had been making progress, but not fast enough to satisfy the aliens. Humanity kept having wars and destroying the environment, which made the aliens question whether humans could ever be trusted with advanced technology. Several alien species in the collective had voted against allowing humans to join, saying that Earth's people were too dangerous and unpredictable. By the 1990s, the situation had become critical. The collective had given Earth a deadline of 2025 to prove that humanity deserved membership. If humans could not demonstrate sufficient progress in technology and peaceful cooperation by that date, the collective would make the decision for them. Earth would be classified as a quarantine world, and all humans would be relocated to an isolated star system where they could not threaten other civilizations. Carl's journal entries from this period showed his growing desperation. He wrote about working 18-hour days, trying to develop the technologies that would save humanity. He had been part of a small team of scientists and engineers from around the world, all working in secret to meet the collective's requirements. They had made amazing progress, developing clean energy sources, medical technologies that could cure most diseases, and communication systems that could reach across the galaxy. But the team had also been shrinking over the years. Some members had died of old age or illness. Others had been reassigned to different projects, and a few had suffered mental breakdowns from the stress and secrecy of their work. By 2020, only a handful of people were left who understood the full scope of the project and knew how to operate the advanced technologies they had developed. Jake found a journal entry from just 6 months before his father's death that explained why Carl had moved to Montana and pretended to be a mechanic. The government had decided that the remaining team members were too valuable to risk having them all in one location. If something happened to one of the research facilities, the entire project could be lost. So they had scattered the team members to different locations around the country, each with their own secure facility where they could continue working. Carl's facility was hidden beneath the farmhouse in Montana. He had been working alone for the past 10 years, maintaining contact with the other team members through encrypted communications and continuing to develop the technologies that humanity needed to prove its worth to the collective. The cover story about being a retired mechanic allowed him to live quietly, without attracting attention from foreign governments or terrorist groups who might try to steal the alien technology. The most recent journal entries showed that Carl had been racing against time. The collective's deadline was now only months away, and the team still had not completed all the requirements for membership. They had developed the necessary technologies, but they still needed to demonstrate that these technologies could be used responsibly and that humanity had evolved beyond its violent tendencies. Carl had been working on a presentation that would show the collective everything humanity had accomplished. The presentation included data about technological breakthroughs, evidence of increased cooperation between nations, statistics showing reduced violence and improved environmental protection, and demonstrations of the advanced technologies the team had developed. If the presentation was successful, Earth would be invited to join the collective as a junior member, with full membership possible after a probationary period. But Carl had died before completing the presentation. According to his final journal entry, written just days before his death, he had been worried about what would happen if he was not able to finish his work. The other team members were too old or too sick to take on the full responsibility, and there was no one else who understood the alien technology well enough to operate it properly. Jake found a sealed envelope with his name on it, hidden behind Carl's journal. Inside was a letter from his father written in case something happened to him before the project was finished. The letter explained everything that Jake had already discovered in the files, but it also contained a personal message that brought tears to his eyes. Carl wrote that he had always wanted to tell Jake the truth about his work, but the security requirements of the project had made it impossible. He had been proud of his son's success in the computer industry, and he believed that Jake had inherited enough of his intelligence and problem-solving ability to continue the work if necessary. The letter explained that Jake's genetic markers would allow him to access all of the alien technology, since the security systems had been programmed to accept Carl's bloodline. The letter ended with a request that broke Jake's heart. Carl asked his son to forgive him for lying about his life and keeping such an important secret. He explained that everything he had done had been to protect Jake and to give humanity a chance at a better future. If Jake chose to continue the year work, he would be taking on the most important responsibility in human history. If he chose not to, Carl would understand, but humanity might lose its last chance to join the galactic community. Jake sat in his father's chair, holding the letter, and looking around the incredible facility that Carl had built and maintained for so many years. He thought about his quiet father who had fixed cars and farm equipment in a small Montana town, never letting anyone know that he was working to save the entire human race. He thought about the aliens who were waiting for humanity to prove itself, worthy of joining their community. And he thought about the deadline that was now only months away. Jake realized that he had a choice to make. He could walk away from all of this, sell the house, and go back to his normal life in Denver. Or he could try to finish what his father had started and give humanity one last chance to join the stars. Jake woke up in his old bedroom the next morning, feeling like he was a teenager again. The sun was coming through the same curtains his mother had hung 20 years ago, and for a moment he forgot that both his parents were gone. Then he remembered the hidden door in the workshop and the strange equipment his father had been hiding. After a quick breakfast of coffee and toast, Jake went back to the workshop. In the daylight, the advanced equipment looked even more out of place. He spent the morning examining everything carefully, trying to understand what it all did. Most of the devices had labels and numbers that meant nothing to him, but some of them were clearly computers of some kind. The screens showed data that was constantly changing, as if the machines were monitoring something. Jake found a filing cabinet that was unlocked and started going through the papers inside. Most of them were technical drawings and diagrams that he could not understand, but there were also some letters and documents that made more sense. One folder contained correspondence with companies he had never heard of, companies with names, like Advanced Dynamic Solutions and Quantum Research Industries. The letters talked about delivery schedules and testing results, but they never explained what was being delivered or tested. Another folder had financial records that showed his father had been receiving large payments from the government for the past 40 years. The amounts were much more than a small-town mechanic could ever make. Some of the payments came from agencies that Jake recognized, like NASA and the Department of Defense, but others came from organizations with confusing names and abbreviations that he had never heard of. The most interesting folder contained what looked like a personnel file with his father's name on it. According to the documents, Carl Morrison had not always been a mechanic. Before moving to Montana, he had been an engineer working on classified projects for the government. The file showed that he had a degree in aerospace engineering from MIT and had worked on several space program projects in the 1970s and early 1980s. Jake sat down in his father's chair and tried to process what he was learning. His father had lied to him his entire life about who he was and what he did for work. Carl had not been a simple mechanic who fixed cars and farm equipment. He had been a highly educated engineer working on secret government projects. But why had he given up that career to move to a small town in Montana and pretend to be something he was not? As Jake continued searching through the files, he found more clues about his father's real work. There were reports about something called Project Gateway and references to contact protocols and communication arrays. Some of the documents mentioned other planets and star systems, which seemed impossible. There were also medical reports that showed his father had been receiving regular health checkups from government doctors. not the local doctor in town that Jake had always thought was treating him. The more Jake learned, the more questions he had. Why had his father kept all of this secret? Why had he pretended to be just a mechanic when he was clearly involved in something much bigger and more important? And what was behind that hidden door that required such advanced security? Jake decided to try a different approach to opening the door. He looked more carefully at the scanner next to it and noticed that it was not just a hand scanner. There was a small lens that looked like it might scan eyes or faces. He stood in front of it and looked directly into the lens. The blue light got brighter and started moving in patterns, but still nothing happened. Then Jake remembered something from the funeral. The funeral director had mentioned that they had used a new preservation technique on his father's body that would keep the hands and face looking natural for much longer than usual. Jake had thought it was strange at the time, but now he wondered if there was another reason for it. Jake drove to the funeral home in town and explained to the director that he needed to see his father one more time for personal reasons. The director was understanding and led him to the room where his father's body was being kept before burial. Carl Morrison looked peaceful, as if he was just sleeping. His hands were folded across his chest, and his face looked exactly as it had in life. Jake felt terrible about what he was going to do, but he needed to know what was behind that door. He carefully lifted his father's right hand and noticed that the skin still felt warm and natural. The preservation technique had worked perfectly. Jake said a quiet goodbye to his father and promised that he would understand why this was necessary. Back at the workshop, Jake placed his father's hand on the scanner. The blue light immediately changed to green, and there was a soft clicking sound from the door. When Jake pushed on it, the door swung open easily, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. Lights automatically came on as he stepped through the doorway, illuminating a corridor that stretched further than he could see. Jake walked down the corridor, amazed at what he was seeing. The walls were made of some kind of metal that reflected the lights in strange ways. The floor was smooth and clean, as if it had been built recently, even though this was supposed to be the basement of an old farmhouse. At the end of the corridor was another door, but this one opened automatically when he approached it. Beyond the second door was a room that took Jake's breath away. It was huge, much larger than the workshop above, and filled with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. There were screens covering entire walls, showing images of space and what looked like other planets. In the center of the room was a chair surrounded by control panels and displays. Everything was clean and modern, and obviously very expensive. Jake walked around the room in amazement, trying to understand what he was seeing. This was not just a hidden room. It was a complete laboratory or control center of some kind. The equipment was running, with lights blinking and displays showing data that was constantly changing. It was clear that his father had been working down here regularly, probably every night after Jake thought he was sleeping. On one wall, there was a large map showing what looked like star systems and travel routes between planets. There were labels in English and also in symbols that Jake did not recognize. Some of the routes were marked in different colors, and there were notes written in his father's handwriting, explaining different types of spacecraft and their capabilities. Jake found a desk with more files and documents. These were different from the ones upstairs. These files contained information about alien species and their technologies, about space travel and communication across vast distances, about treaties and agreements between Earth and other worlds. As Jake read through the documents, he began to understand that his father had been involved in something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The truth was starting to become clear, but it was almost too incredible to believe. His father had not just been working on secret government projects. He had been working on projects involving contact with alien civilizations. The equipment in this room was designed to communicate with beings from other planets. The files contained proof that Earth had been in contact with alien species for decades, and his father had been one of the people responsible for managing that contact. Jake Morrison turned his old pickup truck off the main road and onto the gravel driveway that led to his childhood home. The sound of rocks crunching under his tires brought back memories he had tried to forget for the past 3 months. The farmhouse looked smaller than he remembered, its white paint peeling in places and the front porch sagging slightly on one side. Weeds had grown tall around the foundation, and the flower garden his mother had loved so much was now just a patch of dirt and dead stems. He parked near the front steps and sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the house where he had grown up. It felt strange to be back here without his father waiting inside. Carl Morrison had been a quiet man who worked with his hands and never said much about his past. He had been a mechanic in town for as long as Jake could remember, fixing cars and farm equipment for anyone who needed help. 3 months ago, Carl had died suddenly of a heart attack while working in his shop behind the house. Jake got out of the truck and walked up the front steps. The key was where his father had always kept it, under the loose board on the porch. The door opened with a squeak that reminded him of coming home from school as a kid. The inside of the house smelled like dust and old wood. Everything looked exactly the same as it had when he left for college 15 years ago. The living room still had the same brown couch and the old television that only got 3 channels. The kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast every morning, before school, was covered with a thin layer of dust. His father had lived alone here for 10 years since Jake's mother died, and it showed. There were dishes in the sink and newspapers stacked on the counter. It made Jake sad to see how lonely his father's life had become. Jake had come back to clean out the house and get it ready to sell. He lived in Denver now and had a good job at a computer company. There was nothing left for him in this small Montana town except memories. His neighbors, the Hendersons, had waved at him from their porch when he drove up. They were old friends of his parents and had watched out for his father in his final years. Mrs. Henderson had called him a few weeks after the funeral to tell him about how his father had been acting strange in the months before he died. She said Carl had been working late into the night in his workshop, and strange lights could be seen through the windows. Sometimes there were weird sounds coming from the building, like machines running that she had never heard before. She thought it was just Carl working on some new project, but now she wondered if he had been sick and not telling anyone. Jake walked through the house room by room, trying to decide what to keep and what to throw away. Most of the furniture was old and not worth much. His mother's china was still in the cabinet in the dining room, and there were photo albums full of family pictures that he would take with him. In his old bedroom, everything was exactly as he had left it when he went to college. His high school trophies were still on the shelf, and his bed was still made with the same blue blanket his mother had bought him. His father's bedroom was the hardest room to go through. Carl's clothes were still in the closet, and his reading glasses were on the nightstand next to a book about electronics. Jake found it odd that his father had been reading about electronics. Carl had always been good with his hands, but he had never shown much interest in complicated technical stuff. He was the kind of man who could fix a car engine but never bothered to learn how to use a computer. After going through the house, Jake decided to check out his father's workshop. The building was behind the house, connected to the garage. His father had always kept it locked when Jake was a kid, saying it was too dangerous for children because of all the tools and chemicals. Jake had only been inside a few times, and it had always seemed like a normal repair shop, with workbenches and tool cabinets. The door to the workshop was unlocked, which surprised Jake because his father had always been careful about security. Inside, the workshop looked different than he remembered. There were still the usual tools and workbenches, but there was also equipment that looked much more advanced than anything a small-town mechanic would need. There were computer monitors and electronic devices that Jake did not recognize. Some of the equipment was still powered on, with lights blinking and displays showing numbers and graphs. Jake walked around the workshop, trying to understand what his father had been working on. On one workbench, there were circuit boards and wires arranged in neat patterns. There were also books about physics and engineering that looked like they belonged in a university library, not a mechanic's shop. Some of the books had bookmarks and notes written in his father's handwriting. In the back corner of the workshop, behind some old farming equipment that had not been moved in years, Jake noticed something strange. There was a section of the wall that looked different from the rest. The wood paneling did not match perfectly, and there seemed to be a thin line around a rectangular area about the size of a door. When he looked closer, he could see that it was actually a hidden door. Next to the door was a small panel with a glass surface that glowed with a soft blue light. It looked like some kind of scanner, more advanced than anything Jake had ever seen. When he put his hand near it, the light got brighter, but nothing happened. He tried pushing on the door, but It would not move. Whatever was behind this hidden door, his father had made sure it would stay locked. Jake stood in the workshop for a long time looking at the strange equipment and the hidden door. He realized that there had been much more to his father than he had ever known. Carl Morrison had not been just a simple mechanic living quietly in a small town. He had been working on something important, something secret, something that required advanced technology and knowledge that Jake could not understand. As the sun began to set, Jake locked up the workshop and went back to the house. He had planned to spend just one day here, but now he knew he would need more time. He needed to figure out what his father had been doing and why he had kept it secret for so many years. Tomorrow, he would try to find a way to open that hidden door and discover what secrets his father had been keeping.